All right, so good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you guys, and just want to be able to talk to you about something that I think a lot of us, from a very long time ago, from when we're young till we're old, we always ask questions about this, and it's always a little bit mysterious. The topic itself is a little bit mysterious, and the fact that we are not always prepared to answer these questions is even more mysterious, in my opinion, because it's something that's almost crucial to our faith, which is the authenticity of the Bible. So a lot of people at work or at school will be faced with questions about, I hear you're a Christian, but your book has this and this fallacy, or this and this contradiction, or how do I know if this is actually a holy book? So we're going to attempt today to talk about it. Everything I'm going to say today is easily found on the internet. Most people that will give topics on this specific subject will probably use the exact same arguments, the exact same reasoning. So you might have heard some of this stuff before, but for the sake of those who haven't heard it, we'll be going through it, and maybe you can catch a few things here and there that you haven't heard before. Worst case, it's a refresher. So we'll start with a simple question. Anybody know the difference between absolute truth and relative truth? Anybody?
This is the truth. I think at the end of it, it can be this, but can be also something else. Relative truth is like something related to another thing.
Absolute truth is more about science. We mean that the science coming from East.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's science. Science has a lot of absolute truth. Actually, almost all of it is absolute truth. The difference between absolute truth and relative truth is very simple, is that absolute truth is factual, and relative truth is based on opinion or feelings or emotions. So that's the idea. Now, any apologetic topic such as this will require you, mostly if you want to be effective when you have discussions with people, to use absolute truth, because otherwise it is not factual, it's based on emotion, it's based on your experiences, and it might be not so convincing to someone on the other side of your conversation. So, having said that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview. We're going to look at it from two perspectives, the authenticity of the Bible, from an external perspective, the external evidence, and from internal perspective, and look at different internal evidence that can show the authenticity of the Bible. So we'll start with the external evidence. First, we're going to look at manuscripts, and then I put like the more external evidence is very, good to know type of stuff, but the more interesting stuff is actually in the internal evidence. But you also need to know about the external stuff. So manuscripts is the first point that we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about early non-Christian historians. Then we're going to talk about the miracle of the Bible's preservation. So that's the overview of external evidence. So let's start with manuscripts. So how can we tell that a manuscript is, how can we tell the age of a certain manuscript? You've heard of carbon dating, but what is the other things that we usually use for telling the age of a manuscript? Simply, you have the material used, what is the manuscript made of, the letter size and form can tell you a little bit of the age of the document. The punctuation varied also throughout the years, text divisions, ornamentations, color of the ink, and obviously texture and color of the parchment can also give you an idea of the age of the document. So we'll start with the biggest one. This is the one that, if you've heard of anything about archaeological evidence regarding the Bible, you've probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls have been found, have been dated to all the way back to 67, around let's say 70 AD. The way they were discovered is very interesting. One day they were discovered in Palestine actually. So one day there was a little shepherd boy, his name is Muhammad, and he was running after one of his lost sheep. And he was running after her, and he thought that she might have run into a certain cave. So he took a piece of rock and threw it inside the cave, thinking that's going to scare her and she's going to come out. But to his surprise, when he threw the rock, he heard some sort of pottery breaking. And when he heard that this pottery was breaking, he was curious to know what was inside. and he went inside and he found that there was actually a few vases made out of clay that were containing parchments and scrolls, and he didn't know really what it was, but going through people around, he was able to discover what people say is the biggest discovery in terms of archaeological evidence for the Bible. So the Dead Sea Scrolls contain samples of all of the Old Testament books except Esther. So that's a huge thing. When you think about it, these documents have been preserved very well for 1,900 years. Why do I say this? Because if I remember correctly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1941 or something like this. So it's actually a really, really well-preserved piece of document. Well, actually pieces of document. I'm going to go really quickly through the manuscripts because it's not the most interesting stuff, but you need to know it still. There's also John Reynolds manuscripts. So these were dated back to 125 AD, and they were found in Egypt. What I found really interesting, by the way, is that a lot of these manuscripts were found in Egypt. So they were dated to 125 AD, found in Egypt, and they are the oldest extant fragment of the New Testament. What do we mean by that? We mean that it's not necessarily the whole Old Testament, but it has small little portions of it. And in this case, it's the Gospel of St. John. Another one is the Chester Beatty Papyri. This one was dated back to 200 AD. This was also found in Egypt and contains major portions of the New Testament.
Did they mention which place, where they find the scrolls in Egypt exactly? Which city?
No. I mean, I think this one was bought from a merchant who had found it or something like this. I don't remember specifically. I'm sorry, I don't have that
I
information.
remember hearing something about like Negi Hammadi also, like that they found stuff, but I don't know if that was the original stuff or the stuff that was
It's
fake.
like there's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah,
they do.
The false
Bible. Okay, yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So this contains portions of the New Testament. You have the Gospels, Acts, Paul's epistles, and Revelation. We also have Codex Sinaiticus. This was dated in 340 AD and also found in Egypt. Contains half of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. So here's a little table that shows basically a lot of famous documents throughout history. Probably most famous of these is Homer's Iliad, that a lot of people have studied. And we find here the date that they were written in this column. And we find the earliest copy here, the date of the earliest copy that was found. And in the next column, we have here the gap in terms of numbers of years that separate the time that it was written and the time of the the earliest copy that we have. And here, finally, we have the number of copies of this document. So if you look here, we have a clear advantage in terms of numbers of copies for the New Testament. 5,366 manuscripts for the New Testament versus the next best document, which is 643, which is Homer's Iliad. Not only this, but if you look at the gap between the number of years, the New Testament only has a 50-year gap between the date written and the earliest copy, versus the next best one, which is also Homer's Iliad, which is 400, and maybe here the Roman history by Livy, which was also 400 years. So if people are able to recognize that these documents are legitimate with such a big gap, why can't they recognize that only a 50-year gap for the New Testament is very valid as well, if not more valid? And also when you look at the number of manuscripts. Okay? So this is one thing that you can look at. Also another table that I have here is the early church fathers. So early church fathers, we usually talk about anything before 400 AD. Okay? So from the death of Christ to, let's say, 400 AD, that period we refer to as early church fathers. And again, this is how many times each father has quoted a specific book in the New Testament. And these books have been quoted a whole total number of 36,379 times. Why is this important? It's important because the entire New Testament can be reconstructed from those quotations, except for 11 verses. So if someone took out all the Bibles in the world, but we still had all the church fathers' writings, we could reconstruct the New Testament except for 11 verses.
Do we know which 11 verses?
It's very easy to find, but to be honest with you, I don't know them by heart. But yeah, you can Google it. This is a very common, known fact.
Okay.
All right, so we looked at manuscripts. Now let's look at another form of external evidence, which is early non-Christian historians. What do they say about the Bible and Christianity? Josephus is probably the most famous one, and the reason why I'm putting him first is because it's probably the weakest argument that you will have if you're talking with someone in terms of defense of the Bible, and I will explain later why. So his name is actually Flavius Josephus, but he's mostly referred to in literature as Josephus. He was born in 37 AD and died in 100 AD. He was a Pharisee from the priestly line, so he's actually very knowledgeable in terms of the Jewish religion and culture. In his major work, Antiquities of the Jews, he gives a brief description of Jesus and his mission. Okay, and the most important part that we're talking about here, the biggest, the most referred to extract from him is called the Testimonium Flavinium. What is the Testimonium Flavinium? Basically, he's talking about Jesus Christ. So here's what he says. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was doer of wonderful things, a teacher of such men, and received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. So keep in mind, this guy is a Jewish guy. He's not only a Jewish guy, he's from the priestly line. So for him to write this, it's a big statement. And this is why this is very disputed evidence. The reason being is that it's very hard for people to accept that a Jewish scholar admitted that Christ was the Messiah. Okay?
If he believes like that, he's a Christian.
I'm sorry?
If he believes what they write, he's a Christian.
Yeah, so a lot of people will say this. If he believes what he's writing, he's a Christian. Other people will say he was just a historian referring to the facts. Other people will say, no. I'm just telling you guys this so that you're aware. Other people will say, no, there's a third alternative, which is basically people have altered his writings. His writings did not include this portion, but some Christians in the very old times have altered his writings to include references to Christ. The problem with their argument is that the manuscript evidence favors it. It exists in all the extant copies of this text. So all the copies that we have of this text include this portion. So that's something to keep in mind, but still it's one of the weakest arguments that you can have. It's one of the most popular, but one of the weakest. So another Jewish source, the Talmud, which is known by everyone, refers to on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. And it continues. So this is definitely some scripture that refer outside of the Christian literature that refers to Jesus Christ. Okay?
I guess his miracles are just referred to as sorcery, but it still admits
Yeah.
that he was doing something.
Yeah, it's referred to as sorcery, and that's why he was hanged, but it still refers to him, so it's basically an easy way to prove that Christ walked among us on the earth.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the other thing I just wanted to say, like when you said like the number of manuscripts and stuff like that, I think like I guess the reason that it's like the more the better is that like, you know, if you're gonna change something, you would have to like literally gather all the manuscripts that are all spread out throughout the world. You know, like it's not like you're gonna go into a Word document and change something. Like if you're planning to like mess around with the text or cheat, you have to find every single manuscript that was distributed, collect them, change them, and redistribute them. And that's why like the more manuscripts you have, the more it is almost impossible or not likely at all that something would be altered in.
Exactly, yeah. And the fact that you can reconstruct the whole New Testament from them shows that, you know, there's some sort of continuity within the text. Yes.
Also, if what's the manual of all for 1,500 years, the same that what we have right now, is also an evidence is a good thing.
Yeah, that's why the difference in the gap of times of the first one in time is written, and what you look at what you have now, there's no difference. That's another evidence. So I'll keep going because there's a lot to say. The Roman historian Tacitus, he was a senator, and he referred to Christ. He referred to his execution by Pontius Pilate. He referred to his existence, the existence of early Christians in the early church in Rome. So a lot of scholars agree that he is a very reliable, just like they agree that Josephus is a very reliable historian. In regards to Josephus, they just don't agree on this part. But when it comes to Tacitus, scholars generally very much agree that he's a very reliable historian. And the context of the passage that he refers about Christ is basically when Rome burned down during the reign of Emperor Nero. Some people started blaming the fire on Nero. So what he did was, what this historian is saying is, what he did was he tried to put the blame on the Christians and persecuted them to make it look like they're the ones who started the fire that destroyed Rome. So we'll go through the text. I won't go through the whole thing, but he's basically mentioning that there were people that are called Christians, and they had a leader whose name was Christus, from whom their name is the origin, and they suffered extreme penalty. Just to start, consequently, to get rid of the report. Which report is he referring to? The report that Nero was the one who started the fire. Okay? So, Christus is the leader of the Christians, and he suffered extreme penalty, which is death, at the hands of one of our prosecutors, Pontius Pilate. A most mischievous superstition, which refers to the resurrection. So the Jews called it the most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment. So far it checked. It's, by the time he wrote it, it still made sense what this superstition said. Not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome. And he continues on to say that, whatever evil came out of Judea, referring to Christianity, came to Rome, and like anything bad spreads, when it gets to Rome, it spreads throughout the country, the empire. Now, I want to show you guys, this was Tacitus. Now we look at the timeline to see how important it is to look at the timeline of things. In red, you have all the things relating to Tacitus, and in black, relating to the Gospel of St. Mark, which is one of the earliest writings that we have. So, Caesar's death, which is reported by Tacitus, happened in 44 BC. Tacitus was born in 60 AD. Okay? So the difference is about 100 years. Now, the death of Christ and resurrection, as we know, is between 30 and 33 AD. The Gospel of St. Mark was written in 60 AD. So the difference is 30 years. Look at the difference. 30 years for the Gospel of St. Mark, 100 years for Tacitus, referring to Caesar's death. The difference is alarming because when you look at it, the earliest surviving copy of St. Mark's Gospel is in 60 AD, but the earliest surviving copy of Tacitus is in 950 AD. The difference is very big, yet people like to refer as Tacitus as a very credible historian. So why can't we refer to the Gospel of St. Mark as a very credible document? Now we move on to the miracle of the Bible's preservation. Throughout history, many scholars and intellectuals have been calling for the extinction of the Bible. But it continues to be one of the most, or the most printed book of all times. Over 6 billion copies. 6 billion copies means that as of today, almost each single person in the world would have their own copy.
I have at least 30 at home.
Yeah, you have 30.
There's 39 people.
There's 39 actually. So Voltaire, everybody knows Voltaire. Voltaire in his early days said, in 100 years, this is very interesting. He said, in 100 years, the Bible will not exist. This was his claim. So he said, in 100 years, the Bible will be a forgotten book, only to be found in museums. He was basically making fun of the Bible. What happened was, 100 years later, Voltaire was dead, and his house was purchased by the Geneva Bible Society for the printing and distribution of Bibles. So, what does this tell us? It refers to heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away, like Christ said. Also, over the centuries, the prophets and other messengers of God were persecuted and often killed. We know this. For hundreds of years leading up to the late Middle Ages, religious leaders frequently confiscated and burned Bibles. People were often put to death merely for having a portion of the Bible in their possession. I love this because within a few verses you can see one of God's most amazing plans. Within Acts 1, Acts 8:1 and Acts 8:4. Acts 8:1 says, "At the time of a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered." So because people were persecuted, because Christians were persecuted, they were all scattered all over the place. But therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. So the persecution that was meant to put an end to Christianity and the spread of the gospel, in fact, fueled the spread of the gospel. And this also reminded me of the verse that Joseph said in Genesis, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." So again, the word of God cannot be contained. The word of God cannot be contained and put in a way that it puts in a box and forgotten. Now we turn to internal evidence. So inside internal evidence, we're going to look at a few different things. We're going to look at eyewitness accounts, unfavorable accounts, unity within diversity, scientific accuracy, and prophetic accuracy. Like I said, the internal evidence is a little more interesting than the external evidence, in my opinion. So we'll start with eyewitness accounts. We have a lot of examples of verses that you guys all know about people confirming that what they wrote in the Bible is something that they were eyewitnesses of. So I will not go over all of them. You have all of them here. I'm just going to pick one or two to go through. So, in as much as many we have taken in hand to set in order narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account. I have seen it, and I was there, and it seemed good for me to write it to you. This one is great also. So, in 1 Corinthians 15, and from verse 3 to 6, St. Paul says that he was seen, he being Jesus Christ, he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, after his resurrection. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present. So he was telling us that it's not just the apostles, it's not just Cephas that saw Jesus Christ after his death. There are over 500 people that saw him after his death and resurrection, and they're still alive at the time that Paul was writing. Why is this important? Because like we said, the death of Christ was about 33 AD, and Mark's gospel was written in 60 AD. If Mark wrote things that were not accurate, there are a lot of people that were still alive in that period. Within those 30 years, there are people that were there with Jesus that would have told Mark, hey, when you're writing this is not true. This is not accurate. So this is very important because the first scripture that we have dated, the oldest one dated, is not so far from the actual events. And people were kind of confirming what was written. If it was not true, they would have mentioned it. Now we turn to unfavorable accounts. If I wanted to write a book that was not really true, or anybody else, any human, the first thing that they would do is to make it look as good as possible. They will not find the defaults of people and put them inside. They will not show any weakness in the book. But that's not the case of the Bible. The Bible is very candid in treating sins of people, in treating many different things that would be otherwise unfavorable to the authenticity of the Bible. So let's look at some examples. So the sins of some of the patriarchs are mentioned. The sins of the people which are the chosen people of God, are denounced. So the God Almighty, who is the creator of everything, who knows everything, chose sinful people. This would show something wrong in the narrative, but still the Bible is true to what happened. King David's adultery with Bathsheba and his subsequent attempt to cover it up is also mentioned. The gospel evangelists show their own faults and the faults of the apostles. Even they're writing about themselves, and they show what are their faults. The disorder within the church is exposed. Not everything was rosy. There was problems inside the early church, and every year since then there have been problems. But that doesn't mean that we have to hide it. Peter not eating with those who were uncircumcised. Women found the tomb empty first. If I was living back then and I was writing and I wanted to spread my religion, I wouldn't mention that a woman would be the first one to find it, because people, just the way they think back then, would tell you, well, this is not credible, it's just a bunch of women. That's how people would think back then. I know it's funny to say it now in 2017, but that's the reality. If you really wanted to, create a big hoax, you wouldn't use women to be the first people to find the empty tomb. Jesus calling Peter his follower Satan. Also, why would it be mentioned if I was trying to show that the apostles were perfect people, followers of Christ? So that's just a few examples of unfavorable accounts. Now let's look at unity within diversity. Okay, there's a lot of stuff here, so I'm going to go really quick, but just read along as I'm talking. So the Bible is written over 1,500 years, over 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Keep in mind all the diversities that I'm going to talk about. It was, is written by 40 different authors, kings, military leaders, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, tax collectors, poets, musicians, statesmen, scholars, shepherds. All these are 40 different authors. If you put in a room, forget 40 authors, if you put in a room 2 or 3 different authors, and you ask them to agree on something, it's going to be very, very hard. I don't know how many people we are here, but if we all decided to discuss one specific subject, we might not all agree on the same subject. What else? These are examples of, who were the political leaders and different walks of life from the authors. So it's written in different places. It was written in the wilderness, in a dungeon, on a hillside and in a palace, in prison, while traveling, while in exile. So different places, different authors, coming from different backgrounds, in different languages, written in different times, times of war and sacrifice, times of peace and prosperity, written in different moods, in the mood of joy, in the mood of despair, in the mood of sorrow, in times of certainty, in times of conviction, and times of confusion, in times of doubt. All these are factors that can fuel the diversity. But also we find, as you'll see, that there's different unity. There's definitely unity. There's different literary styles in the Bible. Poetry, historical narrative, song, romance, personal correspondences, memoir, satire, biography, autobiography, law, prophecy, parables, allegory. Different kinds of writings, different kinds of literary styles that are definitely very, very different. Addresses very different topics and subjects. Marriage, divorce and marriage. And these are controversial topics and subjects. Homosexuality, adultery, obedience to authority, nature of God, revelation of God. Definitely, these are topics that if you put a few people in the same room together, they will come up with different opinions and different stances on these topics. So, despite all this that we talked about in terms of diversity, there is one problem that is referred to, which is the problem of sin. There is one theme, which is the theme of salvation. One person, which is the central figure in the whole Bible, which is Christ. And one goal, which is glorifying God. So in spite of the Bible's great diversity, there is perfect unity. The scripture cannot be broken. With men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Think about it once again. All the different kinds of authors, different subjects, different times, different locations, different topics talked about, and still there is no contradiction. Everybody's talking about the same thing, going in the same direction. Now we turn to scientific accuracy of the Bible. So the Bible revealed scientific facts hundreds and thousands of years before science learned about them. So let's look at some examples. Medicine. As recently as year 1600, doctors and scientists still believe that many ailments and diseases were the result of the human body having too much blood. But now science knows it's blood that fights disease, brings nourishment, repairs tissues, and promotes growth. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. This is in Leviticus. Another example in medicine. In the 14th century, the Black Plague decimated the population of Europe. 1 out of 4 people died. It wasn't the scientists or doctors who brought the plague under control. It was the church. What did the church do? They created a system where there was going to be a quarantine. Where did the church get this from? They got it from Leviticus. He shall be unclean all the days he has the sword, he shall be unclean. He is unclean and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. The concept of quarantine in Leviticus, thousands of years earlier. Now let's look at astronomy. Until a few hundred years ago, it was a radical thought to think that the earth was suspended in space. 8,000 years ago, the Bible claimed he hangs the earth on nothing in the book of Job. Astronomy again. Nobody believed the earth was round until 1492. 700 BC, the Bible rule, it was written in the Bible, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, or the sphere of the earth in different translations. This was written in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah. Astronomy again. Until 400 years ago, scientists claimed that there were 1,026 stars that existed. Obviously now we know that it's much more than that, it's unlimited, it's infinite, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered. This was written in Jeremiah. So that's scientific accuracy. Now we turn for the prophetic accuracy. No book in history has dared to predict the future to the degree the Bible has without being proven wrong. How do we know this? This is very interesting, guys. There are 300 direct prophecies about Christ's first coming. Not his second coming, just his first coming. 300 direct prophecies. These are examples of 8 of these prophecies. Only 8 of them. So we know in Isaiah it mentions that he will be born of a virgin, fulfilled in Luke. Micah talks about he will be born in Bethlehem. Genesis, that he would be born of the tribe of Judah. Psalm, he would speak in parables. Zechariah, he would ride on a colt of a donkey. Isaiah, he would heal the brokenhearted. Isaiah, he would be rejected by his own. And I have another one at the bottom that says, he would stand silent before his accusers. All these were fulfilled. These are 8 prophecies. Remember this, 8 out of 300. Now,
only the first one, like I never liked that they include that because there's like no way of proving, like for a non-believer,
yeah,
he'll tell you like why, how do you know that she's a virgin? You know what I mean? But like all the other ones, it's like, yeah, he was born in Bethlehem. They're all.
Yeah, so again, I agree with you, but this is internal evidence. So we're looking at internal evidence. So there requires, maybe some of these evidences requires a little bit of faith, but it just shows that the Bible is not contradictory. In fact, it has a lot of internal evidence to prove that it stands on its own merit. So yeah, I agree 100%. But the idea why I'm showing you guys these ones, these 8 specifically, this is where it gets really interesting. We said there are a total of 300, and I'm referring to these 8. So what are the odds of only 100 of these 300 prophecies being fulfilled in one person? Okay, listen to this. 100 out of the 300 prophecies that are referring to Christ being fulfilled in one person, by the law of chance, it would require 200 billion Earths, each populated with 4 billion people, to come up with one person that can achieve the 100 accurate prophecies without any errors and in sequence. Okay? This is crazy. 200 billion Earths, each populated with 4 billion people, to come up with one person that would fulfill only 100 of the 300 prophecies in sequence. That's basically impossible. You don't understand? Okay, so let me go back. Basically what it's saying is that we know that there's 300 prophecies that refer directly to Christ's first coming. We're looking at what are the probabilities of only 100 of those 300 prophecies to be fulfilled.
So this is based on someone saying like, oh, maybe it's just a coincidence that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that Jesus was, right?
Yeah.
It's a coincidence that all of these prophecies
just happened by chance.
By chance that he fills the whole description.
So we say, okay, let's not look at the chance of it all happening. Let's just say there's a chance that only 100 of those happen. For us to find what is the chance of this 100 being true and in sequence, we would need to have 200 billion planet Earths. Each one of these planet Earths would have to have 4 billion people on it, and then we can find one person that has these 100 prophecies fulfilled all in a row. So it's practically impossible. Okay? If you think this is interesting, watch this next one. I find this is my favorite one. Okay? So, I was going to ask if anybody has a bunch of quarters, but just for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you guys, and we're going to pretend that I have a lot of quarters, okay? 25-cent pieces. So if we have a lot of 25-cent pieces, and we stack them up on top of each other, okay? To the height of 50 centimeters, which is, I brought this here to show you, to be able to visualize it, okay? So this is 50 centimeters. If I were to take 25-cent pieces and stack them up all the way on top of each other like this, in this height, okay? And then I were to spread them all over the state of Texas. How big is the state of Texas? The state of Texas is almost 700,000 square kilometers, okay? So if I were to take all these 25 cents and to be able to spread them all across Texas, and I put them at a depth of ½ meter, and then what I would do is I would mark one of them with an X, and then I would ask someone, I would blindfold someone, and I'll put him in a helicopter, and I'll fly him all over the state of Texas, and I'll tell him, tell me whenever you want to stop, you're going to jump off with a parachute, and when you're going to land, your eyes are still closed, you're going to put your hand down, and you're going to take one quarter, and the quarter that you're going to find is going to be the one that has the red X on it. That is the chance, okay? That is the chance. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about? Okay. This chance of happening would be equivalent to only 8 of the 300 prophecies relating to Christ actually being fulfilled. Okay? Only 8 of the 300 would be fulfilled if we looked at the same odds. What are these odds? It's 1 over this number, which is 1 followed by 17 zeros. Okay? That is the chance to be able to fulfill 8 of the 300 prophecies. So, I believe that we have evidence that demands a verdict. Okay? We have testimony of science. The testimony of science demonstrates it. Testimony of eyewitness confirms it. The manuscripts preserve it. Christ verifies it. The stones support it. The Spirit speaks through it, and the believers are transformed by it. Now, the concept of absolute truth is hated by a lot of people. Why? Because a lot of people want to be in control. They can't fathom that there is something that is an absolute truth that they can't control. But the Bible stands on its own merit. So, the question therefore becomes, with the truth that we discover in the Bible when we read the Bible, what are we going to do with this truth? When there's a promise inside the Bible, after I've discovered that it is authentic and it definitely is coming from God, because this is not a probability thing, it's not a luck thing, what am I going to do with the promises that I'm going to have? But what am I going to do with the commandments that I have when I read the Bible? So, this is what I had to tell you guys about the Bible's authenticity today. Anybody have questions? Because there's a lot of stuff that I didn't put because I know that it gets too long. Any questions, comments? All right, glory be to God for everything. Very much.
You almost persuade me to become a Christian.